provide a little bit more lumber within their supply, but there's no way that they can replace the imports coming from Canada.
Well over 35%.
Canada does not dump lumber into the United States.
Canadian export, the U.S. Commerce Department is hiking anti-dumping duties on Canadian softwood lumber to 20.56%.
Following Washington's decision to impose import tariffs of up to 35% on Canadian goods, Canada recently decided to drastically cut its lumber exports to the U.S. This decision has caused U.S. housing construction costs to skyrocket in a short amount of time. Late morning lumber futures are now recovering. Naturally, it is higher given the news of the 25% tariff on Canada. At the moment, there is a 14.2% charge on Canadian lumber. And as discussions about tightening export quotas continue, Canada is placing U.S. legislators in a challenging position that forces them to find a way to back off. From the tariff policy they impose themselves, Canada is tightening the flow of softwood timber that has been moving south to the United States on a clockwork regularity year after year. And Ottawa says it has a strategy to retaliate against additional U.S. levies on Canadian lumber. In particular, we're talking about reducing the amount of lumber that Canada normally exports to the U.S. each year, 28 million cubic meters, which is not only a huge amount, but also makes up almost 1/3 of all the plank beams and 2x4 boards used in American construction. Why is Canada acting this way? Imagine telling your neighbor that you will no longer lend them sugar. But in this case, the lumber is enough to frame 16 Empire State Buildings each month. If he stops the lumber, do you know whose costs will increase? It's the American people who want to buy a home. To put it in perspective, back in August 2024, the rate was around 14.54%, but by early 2025, it had already soared to 20%. This is evidently due to the U.S.'s decision to increase both anti-dumping and countervailing charges on our softwood lumber, driving the overall tariff rate up to 35%. 56%, it's like the political equivalent of telling you to make your own food and stop relying on us for decades. In other words, they're saying that we'll charge you more just because we can, and how did Canada respond? In that case, we'll just send you less. The United States has regularly applied irrational countervailing and anti-dumping duties against Canadian softwood, alternating between confrontation and cooperation. To be clear, Americans like to portray themselves as capable of providing all the lumber they require on their own, but this is not always the truth. Even at maximum production, they can only satisfy roughly 70% of domestic demand. The remaining 25% to 30% comes from Canada, and their portion of the pie is by no means inconsequential. If Canada withdraws from the game, U.S. contractors will have to pay more to purchase the exact kind of lumber they have been used to purchasing for a long time. Considering their demand, they can only supply roughly 70% of their domestic needs, so they import 30% from outside, with Canada accounting for the majority of that. Industry experts say that supply cuts could increase the cost of constructing a typical family home by an extra $10,000 to $14,000 by 2027. Now, picture yourself as a first-time homebuyer already dealing with exorbitant interest rates, only to discover that your ideal home has just increased in price by tens of thousands of dollars because Canada has decided to stay in this game. Implement these taxes and duties that raise the cost of those imports, so we anticipate that we will only see price hikes. Now, let's discuss why the U.S. cannot just wave a magic wand and replace the lumber supply that Canada is reducing. What about their sawmills? They would really like to increase output. But the issue is that there are a lot of complicated environmental regulations, permitting procedures that could make anyone go insane, a lack of skilled labor, and forest areas are getting smaller because of wildfires. To be honest, none of this makes things simple. It will be many more years before they can even try to compensate for the amount of lumber that Canada has recently removed from the table. Since the United States currently produces between 30 and 35 million cubic meters of softwood lumber yearly, which may seem like a lot, the British Columbia Lumber Organization has denounced the decision and called the duties unfair and punitive. However, keep in mind that their actual demand is several million cubic meters higher. When they look for alternatives elsewhere, Germany offers the most promise at around 2 million cubic meters, followed by Sweden at about 1 million, and Chile. Even when you add them all up, however, they still only make up less than 15% of the lumber that Canada regularly supplies. Additionally, shipping lumber from halfway around the world comes with higher transportation costs and lengthy wait times. This is another unwarranted tariff, and you can count on us to fight it and take specific action to protect those workers. The market is obviously beginning to sway. In March 2025, lumber futures prices jumped to $650 per thousand board feet, and analysts caution that if Canada keeps reducing supplies, that amount might reach $765. This is not the kind of small price increase you can ignore. Rather, it's the kind that significantly raises the cost of building a home. Do you know which states would be most affected by the 10 to 15% increase in construction expenses that the U.S. National Association of Home Builders is already anticipating? Texas, where building is increasing daily, and California, where house prices are already higher than anyone would desire today. I'm announcing a number of new measures to help the softwood lumber industry pivot to a growing Canadian market. The forest industry is a pillar of the Canadian economy, so a sharp increase in lumber prices is nothing short of a punch to the gut. However, it's important to note that Canada is not just sitting back and applauding its hands since U.S. contractors are having no trouble at all. Instead, it is taking use of this opportunity to change course. And it can be said that this move is rather expertly placed inside the long-standing aim to diversify Canada's trade, which means the government is looking for new partners to sell to through the broad and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Yes, that's a mouthful of a name. Canada may export goods to places like Japan without paying excessive tariffs. Singapore and Australia are two nations that do not penalize Canada and want dependable, high-quality supplies. This is energy to the United States with a smile on his face, and it is not just partners in the Asia-Pacific region thanks to the trade agreement between Canada and the European Union. Simply put, its goods are competitively priced, and if they try to destroy Ontario, I will do anything, including cutting off their energy. High-quality wood goods from Canada can now readily enter European markets without worrying about tariffs, meaning that a beautifully designed, engineered wood panel produced in Canada can be installed in a modern office in Berlin or an apartment in Paris without incurring any additional costs due to duties. At the same time, exports to the U.S. are still burdened by sky-high, exorbitant fees as normal to make it evident from the government's point of view that these increases in countervailing taxes and tariffs are unfair and unjustified. Value-added products like processed wood modular prefabricated homes, finished kitchen cabinets, and many other comparable items are becoming the main emphasis of Canadian mills. The explanation is simple. These goods not only command higher prices, but also frequently avoid U.S. penalty tariffs. Let's face it, there is a big difference between exporting a pile of raw lumber and selling a whole precast wall. The former is essentially a finished building component, and buyers are willing to pay more for it. The Prime Minister has announced more than $1 billion to help Canada's struggling softwood lumber industry for convenience, and it is evident that we are starting to see the results of that. Investment while raw lumber exports decreased in 2020, processed wood shipments increased by up to 12%. This was not an accident. It was all part of the plan. Although processed wood makes more money per unit and is not as involved in trade issues with the U.S., the main issue is that domestic supply is getting harder to get. Ecologically sustainable, you can probably guess which way the country will lean. They will likely pay more for their homes, the steel they need, or aluminum when faced with the choice between shipping lumber to the U.S., where barriers are constantly being erected, or keeping it domestically to serve Canada's own construction surge. Construction programs are booming and require large volumes of high-quality wood. The problem is not limited to lumber. A slew of new tariffs targeting related materials like steel, aluminum, and copper are making the construction industry a real nightmare from large infrastructure projects. They rely on over 60% aluminum to arrive in the U.S. for their goods, even though only 16% of aluminum is made there. Tariffs of 35% on Canadian goods in general and a startling 50% on metals specifically are hitting everything at once, from automobile plants to tall skyscrapers. Anyone planning to build or manufacture anything needs to be ready to pay more, and it's not just the framework that costs extra money. It's also the nails, wiring, braces, and even the truck that transports materials to the site are all increasing in price, and the countervailing duties are about to increase due to this absurd Section 232 investigation. As a result, we may have to deal with duties and tariffs collectively, and the effects are not limited to building sites. They're also reaching areas of the U.S. economy that few would have predicted. In the past, Canadians would frequently drive across to border towns on weekends to shop at malls, fill up on gas, grab a meal, and load up on goods to bring home. However, today, parking lots that were once packed are as deserted as ghost towns. This is a prime example of the retail sector along the border, which is currently in free fall. In Erie County, traffic has decreased by 12% on the Peace Bridge and by up to 33% on the Rainbow Bridge. Just because Canadians stopped visiting to buy, New York's tax revenues fell short by $4.9 million in a single month, and they don't expect that to be made up. When revenues decline in the upcoming quarter, budget cuts and fewer services will result, and no one can make good on promises. Prime Minister Carney claims that the new restrictions are required given the current status of Canada-U.S. relations. The United States has long targeted softwood lumber and recently increased anti-dumping taxes on the product. And that leads us to the essence of what Canada is actually doing at the moment. By focusing on supplies for local building, investing in value-added products, and increasing global export markets, lumber is no longer only viewed as a commodity for trade, but also as a strategic component of a much bigger geopolitical game. Canada is creating an ecology that is sustainable, that is independent of the U.S., is akin to telling your largest client that, although we are still in business, we are okay without you south of the border while the U.S. faces numerous difficulties. Housing costs are rising, supply lines are overburdened, and commerce with Canada used to be a reliable source of income, is currently declining. So they have two options: adapt or go back to the negotiation table. To be honest, neither decision is easy to accept at this time because there is fierce competition in the global marketplace. So we must ensure that we are competitive in those areas. So the question now is not where the next shipment of lumber will go, but rather who will set the rules for future trade. Whoever controls the supply has the last say, and Canada currently has the microphone. Canada has just shown that controlling a single vital resource is sufficient to tip the scales of power across an entire continent. This story goes far beyond lumber. It is unequivocal evidence that a province can force an economic powerhouse like the United States to sit down and reevaluate everything when it recognizes its leverage and isn't afraid to use it. Washington cannot afford to overlook the shift from a supplier to a leader in the trade game, because the door opens for Canada to do the same with everything else the U.S. depends on after it has demonstrated that it can do this with lumber.